Jeremy stood in the circle with everyone else assembled in the basement of the community center, finishing the prayer. He'd been coming for some time now. It was hard to work around his schedule, and the prospect of meeting at the church weirded him out a little, so he was happy to hear they had relocated to the community center. He didn't want to be weak. He hated how often he described himself using that word. Weak. It singed his mind like a brand. Too weak to control himself. Too weak to not hurt everyone around him. Too weak to not be an addict. But he got in the program, and he'd stuck with it. All the late nights slamming his head against a wall, his body screaming for a fix. His sponsor was fantastic. Mark had started in the program 18 years ago, and knew all the tells, all the lies of an addict. He'd been able to walk Jeremy back off the cliff more times than he'd care to mention. That night was a big one for Jeremy. He'd gotten his 6-month chip. He felt the smooth gold coin in his hand as he walked out to his car. "Hey, Jerry?" Mark's voice called after him in the parking lot. Jeremy's head turned around to face him. "Yeah, Mark?" Mark's older frame huffed and puffed his way over to Jeremy. "Sorry to spring this on you short notice like this, Jerry, but can I get you a ride home? Linda has my car since hers broke down, and she's not answering her phone. Probably passed out watching TV." Jeremy threw Mark the keys. "Sure, if you're okay driving. You know how much I hate driving." The 15 minutes to Mark's house were spent in relative silence. Jeremy didn't talk much, and he always appreciated that Mark never talked simply for the sake of filling that silence. As they pulled into his driveway, Mark stepped out of the car and walked around to open the door for Jeremy. As Jeremy stepped out of the passenger side door, Mark swept him up into a hug. "I'm so very proud of you, Jeremy," Mark whispered in the ear of the taken-off-guard Jeremy. Thank you, Mark," Jeremy managed to stammer out. Stepping away, Mark's face revealed he'd been crying. Wiping his nose with his sleeve, he said, "Well, you know you can call me anytime, day or night. Remember your steps." With that, Mark turned around and made his way into his house for the night. Preparing himself to drive, Jeremy took a deep breath, slowly let it out, opened the driver's side door, and drove off. Miles down the highway, he saw his exit and flipped on his turn signal. But then the exit came and went, seeming to disappear in his rear view. Silently, he flipped the turn signal off and kept driving. The car eventually found itself in the city. Jeremy parked the car on a side street and sat, watching the people walk by. Then, with a deep breath, he opened the car door, got out, locked it, and started walking. The further he walked, the more broken windows and hard eyes he came in contact with. Jeremy ignored that and kept walking. That's when the itching started. All along his neck and forearms. His pace started to become more erratic. He stopped suddenly at a storefront with boarded-up windows. He stood ramrod straight, as if he were listening for something. The itching had stopped. He found himself being drawn to an alleyway next to the shop. He moved lightly, like a coiled spring, every step hiding explosive energy just under the surface. Peering slightly at the mouth of the alley, he saw two figures. One was prone on the ground, while the other was on all fours, crouched above the first. As Jeremy inched his way into the alley, he could hear something wet and squishy. In his focus on being silent, Jeremy neglected to notice the soda can underfoot. As the can crunched loudly, the figure on all fours whipped its head around. The blood dripping from the prominent fangs jutting out of its open mouth sprayed across the alley in an arc, like a popped water balloon. "Oh, hi, Jerry," the man said, wiping the blood from his mouth as he got up to greet Jeremy. "Hi, Malcolm. Haven't seen you around in a few months. You found a new nest?" "No, I just..." Jeremy eyed the pooling blood gushing out of the prone woman's neck, unblinking. Oh, I'm sorry, Jerry. You want a hit?" Malcolm stepped aside, clearing a path for Jeremy. Jeremy stood still for a solid 20 seconds. Finally, he spoke. "Thanks, Malcolm, but, in a program. I just got my 6-month chip." "Dude, I'm sorry. I had no idea you..." Before Malcolm could finish, Jeremy was already exiting the alley in a blur of movement, and the wet sounds resumed almost immediately. Jeremy had frantically broken into a sprint, gripping the chip in his pocket so tightly he could feel it start to bend in his palm. Once he had cleared at least 10 blocks, he leaned back against an abandoned building's wall, mumbling to himself. "God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." He said it over and over and over again, the moonlight glinting off his long, thick fangs.